If this car had come out in 1988, chances are we would all remember it as the best supercar of the 80s. V12, wedge shape, scissor doors, what is not to like? But the thing is, it came out 3 years later. And by then, things were a bit different. So sit back, grab your favorite beverage, it's story time. This video is brought to you by Selected Car Investment, where we buy and sell only the best collectible cars. Check our website to see if your next car happens to be in stock, or contact us for off-market cars, or if you want help to find your next investment. Today the story is going to be about the Bugatti EB110. If you're following Selected Car Investment on the social media, you will know already that we literally love the EB110. And why is that? Well, obviously, it is one of the rarest supercars of the 90s, and it also has all the tech that you could ever want for a 90s supercar. And there's even a layer more to the car that absolutely fascinates me personally. And that is the history of the car and the spirit of the car, not least, which is what we'll go into more detail with today. You could say the marque Bugatti was one man striving for perfection. And that man was the founder, Ettore Bugatti. You could also say that he very often did achieve perfection on the racing tracks as well as with the road cars. In the 20s and the 30s, the Bugatti marque was at its absolute zenith. The cars were just about the best you could get. With the Bugatti, you had certainly arrived at the absolute top of the automobile hierarchy. With the tragic death of Jean Bugatti, the marque Bugatti went into a very sharp decline, only to completely disappear at the end of the 50s, apparently never to be seen again. But actually, the legacy lived on. The Bugatti cars were so great, so appreciated, so well thought of, that they were still appreciated long after the brand had died. And I bet you at least one of those enthusiasts out there had the dream of reviving the marque. But how could one possibly revive a marque that is so defined by its founder, Ettore Bugatti, and his ideas of how to make a car and indeed how to run a car company? Well, maybe it could work if we found a person who had a similar personality as Ettore Bugatti. Maybe had the dream for quite a while, at least for long enough to let the idea sink in and develop into a plan of how you could actually do it. And finally, if that person then actually acquired the wealth to live out the dream of reviving Bugatti. It turns out that is actually the very short version of how it happened in real life. And I'm of course talking about Romano Artioli, the Italian businessman and entrepreneur, who at some point in the 70s encountered a Bugatti and, as so many people before him, was impressed and fascinated by the technique, the aesthetics and indeed the history of the marque. So impressed, in fact, that the idea sort of developed. Maybe this could be his task in life, to revive this fabulous marque. But that was of course only an idea. It did spend the decade in the back of his head while Artioli was developing his business and along the lines of that business also developing his wealth. And eventually in the 80s he arrived at a point where he could not only dream about the project, but actually set out on the great adventure of reviving the Bugatti marque. Now, if Romano Artioli was to truly honor the spirit of the Bugatti marque, he would have to build the best car in the world. And in the 80s, that would mean he would have to build a supercar. As in the 80s, the world economy was simply booming and conspicuous consumption wasn't even conspicuous. Excess was barely enough. So there could not have been a better time for Artioli to begin to develop his idea of the new Bugatti. Of course, this Bugatti supercar would necessarily, to be true to the Bugatti spirit, have to be the best. And the goalposts were pretty high. Porsche 959, Ferrari GTO, Lamborghini Countach 4 Valvole, he would have to pull something special out of his hat. And that's just what he set out to do. Now, Artioli was the businessman behind the project, not the engineer. But he did put together a team of engineers and designers and technicians who had done this before, and he made them share his ambition of making the newborn Bugatti the benchmark of all the supercars. All the operation was based in Campo Galliano in Italy, and the final part of the puzzle was the acquisition of the rights to the Bugatti name, and then they could set out to work. What would be the benchmark for a supercar in the 80s? Well, Porsche had the 959 with 4-wheel drive and a 6-speed manual gearbox. On the other hand, Ferrari had the F40, fiercely powerful and super sexy looking. And actually Bugatti had to top them both. The Porsche had a 6-cylinder engine, the Ferrari an 8-cylinder engine, and Bugatti immediately topped both of them with a V12 engine in the best Italian tradition. The Porsche and the Ferrari both had 2 turbochargers, but Bugatti topped that by doubling that number to 4 turbochargers on the EB110. Take that, Porsche and Ferrari! I think it's fair to say at this time in the 80s, the F40 had established itself as the supercar of the 80s. But not only was the EB110 much more powerful, it was also 4-wheel driven, so it could put all the power to the ground all the time. Once again, Ferrari beaten hands down. Another aspect where the EB110 beat the Ferrari and the Porsche in technology was in the carbon chassis. It wasn't actually thought to be necessary to have a carbon chassis in the EB, but the technique matured along the development, so it changed from an aluminium chassis to the carbon chassis that it ended up with, and also there beat both competitors. But let's keep the thought of the F40 as the most sexy supercar of the 80s, and maybe one of the most beautiful as well. Did Bugatti achieve the goal of also beating the F40 in the looks aspect? Nah, not in my opinion. That is the only aspect where the EB110 actually falls just a bit short. You see, as part of the dream team behind the revival of the Bugatti marque, Artioli hired master designer Marcello Gandini, who did a wedge design of pure 80s. But even his master hands were not quite approved in the organization, and the team later reworked his design before they ended up with the final EB110 design as we know it today. It is purposeful, it is wedgy, it's powerful, aggressive even, but more beautiful and more sexy than the F40? I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Comment below, please. The climax of the dream of Romano Artioli was finally reached when the EB110 was launched in Paris in 1991 on the 110th birthday of Ettore Bugatti. But how was the car actually received in period? Well, the car itself was great, no doubt about that. But in the 4 years since the idea came up, the world had simply changed. So the EB110 was in effect launched into a world economy no longer as rosy looking as it was in the mid-80s. And that became a huge problem for this fantastic project, not least because of the ambitions behind the project and the factory where the car was to be built. Development costs had been huge, and when sales targets were not met, that immediately became a big problem for the new Bugatti company. In order to get sales back on track, Bugatti tried to enter motorsports. They tried to develop an even hotter version of the EB110, the Supersport. But to cut a long story short, in 1994 the company went into liquidation again, and that seemed to be the end of the revived Bugatti marque. But as before in the Bugatti history, the marque had once again made people aware that they were in the presence of greatness. Und in Deutschland hatte der Jochen Dauer, Rennstallbesitzer und ein klein bisschen Opportunist, erkannt, dass der EB110 Supersport noch mehr in sich hatte. Joke aside. But at least Jochen Dauer was German, and he did acquire the remaining parts of the EB110 project, a lot of spare parts, some semi-assembled cars, and he did finish 5 more cars on the Supersport basis, even turning up the volume a bit. They were not allowed to be called Bugatti, but the Dauer EB110 Supersport might just be the best of the bunch. Which very conveniently leads me to my own story with the EB110. When I first encountered one and drove one, it was a Dauer EB110 Supersport. At that time, I was already a huge fan of the EB110 from the magazines and the videos. I knew a bit about the car, and some say you should never meet your heroes. Well, they are so wrong. That encounter with the Dauer Supersport I will never ever forget. The settings were perfect. We filmed the car in beautiful surroundings in the workshop of a proper Bugatti enthusiast. Everything was perfect. The car was powerful, the finish was beautiful, and it was barely run in. And I had to drive it. That's a moment I will never forget. And that day even ended in the most perfect settings, driving into the sunset. It was a huge and defining moment for me as an EB110 enthusiast. And as I said, that was the Supersport, a more powerful and lighter version of the GT. But we've had many of these cars through selected car investment, and I've driven most of them, and even the GT is a terrific experience to drive. Powerful, comfortable, and in my opinion, a spectacular supercar, if ever there was one. And I'm not the only one in our team at Selected Car Investment feeling like that about the EB110. So if this story has awakened an EB110 desire in you, please do not hesitate in contacting us. But let's get back to the Dauer for a moment. How did the German adventure of Bugatti actually fare? Well, not much better than Artioli's version of the Bugatti revival. Dauer built the 5 mentioned cars, and they were great, but maybe it was all too much, too soon, and the 90s were just not the right period for this supercar. So Dauer also went into liquidation, and apparently in the mid-90s the Bugatti revival history was really over. Well, the Bugatti name is tough. As we now know, VAG bought the remains of Artioli's and Dauer's Bugatti adventure and built upon that. And the marque is actually doing very well today, building the fastest, most beautiful, most perfect supercars. But that might be a story for another episode. If you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And also feel welcome to comment below if you have a dream car you would like to hear some stories about. See you for the next one.